So today we're honored to be joined by my colleague, Katrice Hardy, the executive editor of the Dallas Morning News, Medium Giant's sister company. Katrice is a Pulitzer Prize-winning editor, a strategic leader, and innovator who loves producing hard-hitting journalism that impacts the communities we live in and that we care about. As executive editor, Katrice carries the banner of continuing the legacy of award-winning journalism at the Morning News, where she's put an emphasis on finding and sharing stories that represent the challenges and opportunities with all communities across North Texas. Prior to joining the Morning News, Katrice served as executive editor of the Indy Star, the executive editor of the Greenville News in South Carolina, and was also managing editor of the Virginian Pilot. She's also a proud graduate of Louisiana State University.
Say again?
Yeah, go Tigers. And she is also an unapologetic Saints fan. Anybody who was in this building after the Saints whipped the Cowboys could attest to the level of her fandom. So anyway, with all that, we are so excited to have you here today. Thanks for joining us, Katrice.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, this is exciting. So you and I have been talking about storytelling quite a bit over the past few months. We always like to start off these episodes by asking our guests to tell their story. So what would you like the audience to know about your personal story?
So beyond the highlights of LSU and the Saints,
there you
I
go.
should say,
There you go.
I think, for me, the thing that I would like to relay to everyone is that I grew up in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, with two hardworking parents who always instilled in me really to be the best that I could be at whatever that was. Now, they probably wanted me to go in the medical profession, and they told me that. But I was truly drawn to journalism because I just did not see stories in my community of people who look like me reflected on television, unless, frankly, it was a news about crime or something negative.
Right.
And so, and I'll date myself here, but I remember when Dan Rather would end his newscast by zooming in on some community in some part of the country that most of us had never heard of, and it would be a positive story about somebody, some local hero, quietly impacting and serving others. And that was the reason I went into journalism.
Wow. So once you got into journalism, what was it that kept you there? Like, what was the hook? Because, hopefully everybody in their career at some point sort of has that epiphany. So it's like, okay, this is how I can contribute back to tell those stories. What was your first experience when you actually got into the field where you're like, oh my gosh, I can really make a difference here?
First, I remember being extremely afraid because I realized, the power of the word is so incredible, especially in print. And it can really help someone, but it can also really hurt someone or a community. And so I think the thing that kept me with it was the impact that the journalism was having on the communities that I lived in and that I covered and that I served. One thing that I think people forget is that we as journalists live in those communities ourselves.
Right.
So we want to do work that helps our communities be stronger and that helps us become the best in the country at whatever that issue we might highlight is. And so I think that's what drew me to journalism and has kept me into journalism because in a way, the impact you can have with the work every single day can have such widespread impacts on other communities and even future generations.
Absolutely. So let's talk about your time at the Morning News and you guys, the paper. Obviously, there are breaking news events that you guys are obligated to cover, but I think the real magic for what your team has been able to accomplish has really been finding the stories that maybe people don't know about or maybe have very, very topical knowledge of, but when it's been brought to life, it's really had an impact. Give me one or two examples of the stories that you guys have worked on that you're most proud of.
I think there's so many. We've just got a wonderful staff of talented journalists. I think the ones that come to mind are the stories we've done mostly that people were surprised by. So last year, we spent 30 days on a project called Deadly Fake, and that really was helping the community see how fentanyl is killing so many lives of people who frankly didn't even know that they were taking fentanyl or the things that they were using had fentanyl in it. And we told that story really innovatively. It wasn't just about the science. It wasn't just about what happens in court. It was really about how people live their lives every day and have been harmed by it or shocked to learn that a loved one actually fell victim to fentanyl. And so those 30 days, there were stories of such heartache and also some stories of actually positive hope. And that was the whole idea. We had so many institutions here allow us inside of their doors. We got inside of Parkland. We rode with DEA agents. We got access because people in our community care and they wanted the word and the message to be out to help warn their children and others about this horrible, horrible drug. So that's one I'm really, really proud of.
Well, and what's interesting about that is, as a journalist, you feel obligated to try and cover both sides of a story. But in this case, It's like there were 10 sides of a story.
Absolutely. No question. And even, some of those pieces were literally first-person pieces from people who either are counseling folks with have been taking fentanyl, or actually from a fentanyl user. I mean, this woman who knows it could kill her and has tried to get off of it and can't. And she told her story in such a raw and emotional way. I think another story that I'm really proud that we spent some time on last year is a project called Bleeding Out. And it was a really look at something that I had never even heard of, but more people earlier in their lives before the age of 50 die from trauma, so car accidents and things like that, than any other disease. But the issue with that is if there was easier access to blood, like on ER trucks, many of those people would not have died tragically. And so that whole project was about how we could potentially change laws and improve the system so that we could have blood on ER trucks to better serve people quicker after these serious injuries. And so it was, again, another remarkable award-winning project that a reporter learned about, started really just kind of doing some work into it and reporting on it. And it bore also, a week-long project that we're really, really proud of. And we're actually seeing Dallas is now exploring a pilot program to put blood on its trucks. Again, impact.
Well, it's amazing because those are the kinds of stories of things that people just take for granted and assume, if you've been injured and you're in need of a transfusion, that it's just going to be readily available, and it's not.
No, absolutely not. I think the third one I would love to mention is our work on just looking at the tolls here. Everywhere we drive, everywhere we live, there are tolls in our community.
My monthly statement says exactly that.
Yes, and it's not cheap. Although, but for some of us, that's kind of the only way we can get where we need to in a timely fashion.
Yep.
And so the project really explored why the state has so many tolls, how it has some of the most mileage of tolls outside of the country, outside of Florida.
Right.
And basically why the costs of them have just gotten so astronomical. Why, honestly, while most people might not want more tolls, it might be the only way that we can serve our community in the future with all the growth here. And so that project called Toll Trap kicked off earlier this year, and there'll be a few more pieces that are coming from that. But you do have lawmakers now looking at tolls and seeing if they can be some reform efforts around helping those of us who have to drive them every day.
Another great story. So let's get into a little bit more of the gritty details of from your perspective as an editor, what makes for a great story? Like when you're looking at different pitches that your team is going out and finding and they're bringing to you, what are the things that you're looking for that draw you in to push forward and flesh that out and see where it goes?
I think how it's going to impact the lives of our community. So we look for stories that bring emotion, that help people want to actually take action. That's always the top of our list. We look for stories, frankly, that are going to make people proud to live here. So in the past year, we've created a new beat for a reporter, Sarah Heppel, who covers high-profile stories. And she's writing a piece
about the Fletcher's family over the weekend.
Yes.
It was awesome. It was great.
She's writing about people who are doing really remarkable, fun, enlightening things, but also people who have huge impact in our community that you might not have known about. Kind of the story behind the story that's fascinating. And so I think, anything that is making people smile, cry, again, drive somewhere, give money, that's what we look for.
I think it's funny because in a sense, what a journalist does and what somebody in the advertising business does are very different because we have clients paying us to drive a specific result.
Right.
But you guys are also looking for an outcome or an action, whether it's to care about an issue, to maybe write your congressman or, ask your city council, why there are so many potholes or why certain neighborhoods are neglected or those kinds of things. So in the end, stories are meant to drive action, whether it's us on the advertising side or you guys on the journalism side.
Absolutely. I mean, something like you don't have time to look at the proposed budget for your city next year, but that's our job for you. And so you might not have known, for instance, recently we wrote about a library that was about to be closed or was proposed to be closed as part of a city budget. And, those stories led so many people to go out and talk to their representatives about it. Yeah. And now it might stay open. But again, you might not have known that without journalists actually reviewing and analyzing that budget to tell you that story.
Yeah. So what's interesting about your background as a journalist is that you also spend a lot of time on the digital journalism side and developing that. And, I think one of the challenges that all media companies now have are, we have this amazing history of a great print product, but we also have a website and we think about the e-paper, but storytelling can and should happen across a variety of formats. So when you guys are thinking about not just the story itself, but how to tell it, how does that come into play for you guys?
Oh, we think about storytelling as it's it's multifaceted, right?
Yep.
And so is there a video opportunity? Because there should be.
Right.
Potentially, is there audio opportunity? I don't know if people know, we also have podcasts.
Lots of podcasts.
We sure do.
Yes.
Yeah, Eat, Drink, DFW is one of our most popular.
Yes. Yes.
We think about graphics. How can we help you process this information in a way that's easy? We think about maps. We want to show, not just tell you about something, but show you where it is. And then we think about, how can we get this information in front of you, not just, as you mentioned, in print, but, on social media. Our stories live there. On YouTube, our videos live there. In our newsletters, which stories today do we want to bring to you in newsletter format so that you can maybe pay a little attention with them? And we also do something called push alerts, where if there's major breaking news or something we think that you might want to know more immediately, that's a way to send a push alert to your computer, to your phone, so that you can then read that story that way. And so for us, all those platforms help us really understand the patterns that our audience has with our content, but more importantly, what they want to read and what they are reading.
So your commentary on graphics is really interesting, because I'll use an analogy, and all of us have sat through untold numbers of presentations of PowerPoints that just sucked, and they didn't tell a good story, and they're full of words and numbers. You're like, oh my God, what am I looking at? But I'm here. I guess I'm going to have to understand it. But when you guys are using graphics to tell stories, like, you have to figure out how do you communicate this point in a really compelling way, literally in a matter of seconds. Otherwise, they're not going to pay attention to it. Otherwise, they're not going to get it. Otherwise, it's not enhancing the story in a way that it could. So how do you guys think about graphics, or even some of the some of the illustrations that you guys also use?
I will tell you that's because of the talent of the people who work in the Dallas Morning News. I mean, we have some incredible artists. One of our most popular is Michael Hogue.
Yep.
The way he can take some of the most complex pieces of information and distill them into something so entertaining and informative is just truly impressive and amazing. And so that's how we think about it. I mean, often I'll tell you, we don't even know what Michael's going to come up with or how it could be so informative and entertaining, but he figures out a way to do it. And from every project I mentioned to even he had this really cool idea about, folks at American Airlines, the center, they actually get a lot of calls about the airline.
Okay.
And so he did this really cool, piece, artist piece on all the people who work at the American Airlines Center. Okay. As a part of that reporting, he learned this. And so then that led to another story about how the folks who take the calls at the American Airlines Center, they now have a little pitch about, no, this isn't the airline. And so anyway, his artwork also was reflective of that. And I also think, we have another graphic artist who is constantly just thinking, how can I distill this in a chart, in a bar, and all the ways that might be an easy takeaway. And so while we might have that long, involved piece about, say, the tolls, we're also going to probably have a really short piece where it's 4 things to know about the tolls through graphics.
Yep.
That's all a way of kind of helping time-starved readers process that information more easily.
Well, and then also think, again, you're talking about different formats, so somebody might want to read that long piece, but there's a way to chop it up digitally to where somebody's just seeing that nugget, and that graphic might tell the story that they want, or they might be more interested. They might click into that, and it might get you to the whole article. So that's
absolutely.
I think that's where the magic of understanding how all the parts across the ecosystem connect.
Correct. And look, it's all amazing storytelling. Might not be the traditional way. When let's face it, you and I only had books and print products. Yeah. But still all these, and I do too. But all these other ways are how all of us are consuming information differently now.
Talk about storytelling in that way and meeting people where they are, because if we're gonna make sure that those who are younger than us continue to be interested in the news, I think just assuming that they want to consume it the way that you and I do is folly. So how do you talk about meeting people where they are in that way, in terms of how you tell those stories?
We think a lot about, so I think about my child's generation. So my child is going to be 16, my daughter, in February. And so I think about the way she consumes her news is largely through video. Yep. And so that's part of kind of how we assess, should this be a video? And frankly, I'll say this to you, most things should also have video with it. And so we think about that. We also look at the pattern. So I mentioned we can see how long someone is reading a story. Right. We could see what time that story is really, really popular and gaining steam. And so we might look at that story and say, hey, we've got two ways of telling that story. Maybe that story right now has a long traditional kind of piece, but it also has a photo gallery, but it's getting so much interest. Maybe we should go back in and also add a photo. And maybe that is something we should put in the newsletter today. And maybe that is something we can maybe pull out some of those graphics in the longer form and actually have a shorter story with those graphics. And if people want to read the longer story, they can refer back to it. So we're constantly looking at that. We even look at the headlines. So a headline on a story that you thought should have done really well, but we're looking at it going, people aren't seeming to connect with it. So maybe we should tweak the headline a little bit. And then sometimes that helps the story also resonate better. So all those aspects of storytelling and platforms are what we spend most of our time on every day.
So this is a little pushing down on that a little bit. This is a bit of an inside baseball question. So like, let's say that you guys are working towards, and this is, I guess, where you have some flexibility too, because you've got typeset deadlines for print where a story has to go where it's going to go. But after that, you guys can continue to tinker with it online and chop it up. So like, talk about that process of constant iteration. Is that, you say it's happening constantly, but sometimes you're very time crunched. So I'm just fascinated about how those decisions are made.
Correct.
In real time.
So if you think about it, the one thing that the news industry, in particular newspapers, have done well is print.
Yes.
Right. So we know how to do print.
Yep.
And print, frankly, for us, because we're so fortunate to work for a company where we have our own printing press and printing department. And so we can have much later deadlines. So really what we do during the day is really focus on digital storytelling. And the way we approach it is we want to be first. We want to be accurate. We want to have a sense of urgency, but we also want to give you stories that you can't get anywhere else.
Right.
And so throughout the day, if there's a breaking story, and let's face it, we have a ton of breaking stories, right? Let's get something out there so people know what's happening, but then let's keep going back to it and updating it. And then at a certain point, you're absolutely right. There is a print deadline.
Right.
And so that might be, we'll know that story, the ultimate story that's going to go in print has to be in there at 8 and maybe, or 10 or 11. And so we'll finish it up, move it over, but then we're still working on that.
Right.
We have people who work late. They come in really early. We're still updating that or often writing additional stories to go with that.
I think that's probably a space too where you can sort of extend that story out. So you see maybe an initial breaking news alert and then it shows up in print and then the journalist might continue to tell that story the next day with iteration. So it's an opportunity to elongate a story or continue a story or maybe pivot a story depending on what information comes in. So that, I think that's the unique opportunity and the set of tools that you guys have at your disposal.
Absolutely. And we've had, I'll take this one example of, the tragedy of the Allen Mall shooting.
Yeah.
Pretty quickly there was, what is happening? What do we know? There was stories from people at the scene. There was then the stories about, who was harmed, stories about potential folks that the police were talking to, stories about security. That story lived on for weeks and months after, even a year after we went back to see how some of those store owners were doing. And so there's constant iterations of those stories.
Love it. Okay, so as we look across the journalistic landscape, what stories do you think we have in overabundance?
That's a great question. Probably crime stories across the industry. And I'll tell you, and it's when I say crime, it's more this happened, that happened, this happened. Where we don't have an overabundance.
Almost like a police report.
Correct.
Right.
What we don't have an overabundance of, to me, is how safe is the community truly? What programs are really working? So kind of digging behind those facts. One thing I'm incredibly proud of is this year we put a lot of focus on writing about every victim of homicide in Dallas this year.
Yep.
And the reason is because we write these stories and say, so-and-so died and the police are investigating, but we never check back in on who these people are and what they meant to their families and to the community. And some of the stories we've written for this project, it's a tragedy of how, in some cases, how these people have died and what they've left behind. Part of that reporting led us to realize that we had something like 25 teenagers that have been killed as a part of homicides this year. We would not have known that had we not started to uncover, these stories and write about everyone.
They're not just numbers, right?
Correct. They're, absolutely key people in our community.
Yeah. And even if they, I think to dignify each one of them, regardless of whatever they did in life, like they're a human being. And I think bringing light to their stories is something you guys can do that nobody else can.
I agree. And we've really enjoyed being able to walk into the homes of family members who've opened their homes to us at some of the worst times in their life and tell us about their loved ones.
That's great. I love that. So you talked about that being an example of maybe what we don't have enough of. What other stories are out there that we don't see enough of that are there?
I think stories about, local heroes. We try really hard to, and part of our mission, our newsroom mission, is to also highlight the amazing people and programs here, things that really make North Texas special. But I think across our industry, no matter where you are, people want to see more and more of those. And so in the past year, we've added a couple of beats. As I mentioned, high profile is one. We now have kind of a features trending kind of celebrity reporter. So when Tom Brady comes here and eats at Albernays, and one of our food writers told that story, we're going to let you know that.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I think we were talking about it. People, broccoli is good, but dessert's not bad either.
Absolutely. People want to have fun.
All things in moderation.
Yes.
I love that. So when you think about great storytelling evolving over the next decade in the journalism space, what are the biggest evolutions you see?
I think AI is going to be a tremendous evolution. Now, what that looks like, I don't know. But also, if you think about how, again, we just had the print product and we would put it on the doorsteps and we assumed that every story we put in print, people read. We had no way of tracking that or knowing. Sure. We've evolved into having lots of information now, real-time information on how people are consuming our news and what they're reading. And so I think the next evolution is, what are those platforms, what are those avenues to reach people in different ways? And frankly, how to reach younger people who are really hungry for information, but they want to consume it very differently.
Yeah, absolutely. So in the field of journalism, what gives you the most hope for the future? Because, you see such a fractured world right now. People wanting to sit in their own echo chambers or really not go out and be willing to dispassionately examine an issue, and sometimes they're looking for news outlets or news outlets that are going to feed them things that they want to hear. So what makes you hopeful that we're going to get to a better place to where the press can actually do the service that they originally intended to do, which is to inform the public in a meaningful way? What gives you hope?
I think every time we are able to publish, journalism with impact, and then there is some impact, something that changes a law, or, sometimes we've written about a community in need, and so many people in this community have stepped up and helped by delivering coats or dropping off money or food. Yep. That gives me hope. And so the more we can tell those stories, we can remind people, here's what the impact of this work was to this person, to that community. Here's how, this one person we featured, got 100 letters saying thank you. Those things, I think that's how we can set ourselves apart and how we can remind people of the importance of local journalism.
Love it. Katrice, this has been great. Thank you so much for joining me, my friend.
Thank you for having me. I really appreciate it.
All right.